They thought ignoring me would hurt. But how would you feel if your parents skipped your Christmas dinner then woke up to see it on national TV? While they stayed home pretending I didn't exist, I was feeding 20 kids in the house they said I'd never build. The lights, the laughter, the truth. It all went viral. And by morning, the daughter they dismissed had become the story they couldn't escape. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe smash like button and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The fog had rolled in thick that morning, blurring the cliffs along the Pacific like a half-forgotten dream. From my studio inside the glass walls of Soul Cliff Villa, I could barely see the water below, but I could hear it. The deep, steady rhythm of the tide slapping against the rocks. The ocean had its own way of breathing, and on quiet mornings like this, it almost felt like it was breathing with me. My pencil slid across the drafting paper tracing the last details of the kitchen design. The golden light from the pendant lamp above my desk fell in a narrow pool, warm against the cold blue-gray outside. Every line mattered. Every inch of this house was something I'd touched, planned, built. My phone buzzed. The sound broke through the hum of the waves. I didn't look at it right away. I already knew who it would be. When I finally picked it up, the message was short. Sharp, like a paper cut. No one in the family is coming to your Christmas dinner. It's a waste of time. It was from my mother. I stared at the screen until the words started to blur. There it was again. That familiar mixture of sting and numbness, the kind that didn't shock me anymore, but still hurt, just enough to remind me I hadn't completely stopped hoping. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I typed 2 words. That's okay. And maybe for the first time it actually was. I set the phone face down on the table and turned toward the sea. The fog pressed against the glass like breath. The waves below were invisible now, but I could still hear them moving, pulling back and returning again. Persistent, endless. I walked to the long walnut table that stood in the center of the room, my fingertips grazing its surface. I'd designed it myself, 6 meters of smooth, sanded wood that caught every bit of light. Even if no one comes, I whispered, tracing the grain with my hand. Someone will sit here. I opened the cabinet near the wall and pulled out a worn leather notebook. The cover was speckled with sawdust and faint pencil marks from months ago. On the first page in block letters I'd written, "A seat for everyone who never had one." The sentence stared back at me like a promise I hadn't realized I'd made. Outside, a gull screamed somewhere in the mist. I could almost see the shape of it gliding over the water before disappearing into white. The air smelled of salt and pine and faint cedar from the beams above me. This house had its own scent now, a mixture of work and waiting. I sat down at the end of the table and flipped through the pages of the notebook. Sketches of the dinner layout filled the first few spreads. The lighting plan, a list of local food suppliers, possible guests, at least the ones I'd dared to hope might come. My parents' names were written on the list once, then crossed out. The pen stroke still pressed deep into the paper. I ran my finger over it. The indentation was small, but it left a mark. "How many times have I crossed you out?" I murmured under my breath, not sure if I was talking to the paper or to them. I leaned back in the chair, eyes on the ceiling. The faint hum of the ocean filled the silence, steady like a heartbeat. My mother's words echoed again, clear and unshakable, a waste of time. It wasn't just the dinner she meant. It never was. The truth was I'd spent most of my life trying to make something she wouldn't call a waste. Straight A's, scholarships, the architectural awards. None of it had ever been enough to pull her eyes away from Lydia. Lydia with her perfect voice, her wedding photos framed in the living room, her Christmas cards, with smiling children and matching sweaters. My parents loved posting about her new house last year, the one they helped her buy in Portland. I built mine from the ground up and didn't even get a text. I stood up, walked to the wide window and pushed it open. The wind rushed in cold and alive. It filled the room with the scent of sea spray. I breathed it in until my chest ached. I remembered being a kid waiting at the kitchen table while Mom and Dad fussed over Lydia's dance recital, the sound of wrapping paper and laughter spilling through the house. I'd sat there with my small, crooked science fair trophy in my lap, waiting for someone to notice. They hadn't. That memory was sharp enough to still draw blood even after 20 years. When did I start expecting the no's? I whispered to the wind. The question hung in the air. I didn't have an answer. Maybe it began the day I realized love in our family was conditional, something you earned with perfection or charm, or just being easier to love. Maybe it began when I stopped asking for more. I looked down at my hands, the small scars on my knuckles from cutting wood, sanding too long, working late nights to finish this house. Every one of them meant something. Each was proof that I'd kept building even when there was no applause, no approval, just me and the sound of nails sinking into wood. The waves crashed louder now. Somewhere beneath the fog, the ocean kept moving, uncaring, unstoppable. I pressed my palms flat against the cold glass and let that steadiness seep into me. Behind me, the house was silent. Just the ticking of the clock above the fireplace, the hum of the heater, the faint creak of wood settling. Soul. Cliff Villa didn't feel empty to me. Not anymore. It felt like potential, like breath held before something begins. I turned off the drafting lamp, letting the gray afternoon fill the space. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. A woman with tired eyes, ink smudged on her fingertips, and a quiet kind of strength I hadn't noticed before. I smiled, not out of joy exactly, but out of recognition. The version of me that used to beg for a seat at their table was gone. I closed the notebook, placed it carefully on the table, and whispered, "Let's make it count this year." Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing a strip of horizon. The ocean shimmered faintly under the fading light, endless and steady. I stood there for a long time, just listening, feeling something shift inside me, something small, but certain. The house, the dinner, the silence. It all finally made sense. And for the first time, their absence didn't feel like a wound. It felt like space. Space for something new to begin. The smell of pine and sugar cookies always meant Christmas in Portland. I can still see the tree in the corner of our old living room, strings of colored lights, tinsel clinging to the carpet, the faint hum of a holiday record spinning on the stereo. Lydia sat cross-legged in her red pajamas, her blonde curls tied up in ribbons, waiting for the biggest box under the tree. I sat beside her, holding a smaller one, light enough to balance on one palm. She tore through the wrapping paper, squealing when the shiny doll appeared. "She talks when you press her hand," she said, pressing the button so the plastic voice chirped. "I love you, Mommy, my mother." Eleanor clapped her hands together, eyes bright. "You've wanted that all year," she said. Then she looked at me. "Go ahead." "Maddie, open yours." I peeled the tape slowly, careful not to rip the paper. Inside was a plain white notebook. No name, no lines, just empty pages. Mom smiled like she'd done something thoughtful. "You like drawing, don't you?" "This will keep you busy." I remember the way she said it. Keep you busy, not make you happy. I mumbled a thank you. Lydia was already parading the doll across the floor. That was the first Christmas I noticed the weight of things. The way Lydia's gifts were heavy, solid, shining with effort, while mine were light enough to slip through your fingers. I used to tell myself it didn't matter, that maybe Mom just didn't know what to buy me. But deep down, I think I already understood. When I was 12, I built a model house out of cardboard and glue. It wasn't perfect. The roof slanted, the windows were uneven, but it felt like something alive. I worked on it for weeks after school, cutting scraps from cereal boxes, painting tiny walls. My teacher entered it in the district science fair. I won first place. That evening I came home holding the ribbon like a miracle. "Mom, Dad, look what I won." My father, Robert, was watching the evening news. He glanced at it once, nodded. "That's good, sweetheart. Just don't stay up late again. You need your sleep." My mother didn't even look up from the sink. "Science fairs are fun, but you know you can't just live in your imagination forever." I stood there holding the ribbon water dripping from the dishes, clinking against porcelain. Lydia wandered in a few minutes later, humming. Guess what she said? "Mrs. Johnson says I might be in the school play next month." Mom turned, eyes lighting up instantly. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful. We'll invite the neighbors." I slipped the ribbon into my pocket and walked upstairs. That night, I left the cardboard house on my nightstand and stared at it until I fell asleep. Even now, I can still see it in my mind, its crooked little roof, its walls held together by glue and stubbornness. Maybe it was the first house I ever built that felt like mine. A few months later, Lydia won a small art contest for a drawing of a cat. Mom threw her a party. There were cupcakes and balloons, neighbors laughing in our kitchen. I remember helping serve lemonade while Lydia held up her picture for everyone to see. No one asked about the model house gathering dust in my room. When I tried to sneak upstairs, Mom called after me, "Don't be rude." "Maddie, smile for your sister's picture." I smiled. I always smiled. I think that's how I learned invisibility, one polite grin at a time. In our family, love had a spotlight. It didn't move often, but when it did, it was dazzling. Lydia lived under it. She glowed there naturally. I learned to exist in the shadows around her, quiet, careful, making sure not to interrupt the scene. By 15, I'd stopped expecting fairness. I spent most of my afternoons in my tiny room sketching buildings I'd never seen. My walls were covered with taped pages, blueprints drawn in pencil shading, where the windows should catch light. The house always looked the same: tall ceilings, wide windows, a single long table at the center. It was the kind of house where no one sat at the edge of the conversation. Sometimes, when the laughter got loud downstairs, I'd press my ear to the wall and imagine that somewhere in some future I couldn't name yet, I'd be building something that lasted longer than attention. One evening, I came home to find my mother setting the table for another celebration. Lydia had been voted most likely to succeed in her class. "Can you take the trash out?" Mom said without looking up. I did, then stood outside for a while, breathing in the damp Oregon air, the smell of wet cedar mixed with smoke from someone's chimney. Inside, through the kitchen window, I could see my family laughing. Lydia was waving her certificate like a flag. I watched until my fingers went numb from the cold. Then I went back to my room and picked up a dull pencil. On the back of a math worksheet, I wrote a sentence that felt like both a wish and a vow. Home is something I'll build myself. That winter, I bought my first set of sketching pens with money from a babysitting job. I used the notebook Mom gave me that Christmas. Each blank page became a piece of a dream I couldn't yet name, lines turning into walls, walls, into rooms, rooms, into safety. Years later, when I designed Salcliffe Villa, I found that notebook again. The pages were thin, yellowed at the edges. But on one of them, in my 15-year-old handwriting, I'd scrawled something that stopped me cold. Maybe if I build it, they'll finally see me. The girl who wrote that didn't know that visibility isn't something you wait for. It's something you build plank by plank until one day it stands taller than anyone's approval. I can still remember the glow of that room on the night I wrote it. The faint hum of the heater, the soft buzz of laughter downstairs, and the pale light of the moon through the window. It fell across my sketch pad, silver and steady. I drew until my hand cramped, until my eyes blurred, until the world outside that window didn't matter anymore. And when I finally turned off the lamp, the moonlight stayed, spilling over the walls, over the paper, over the quiet shape of a girl who was already designing her way out of the shadows. The morning I left Portland smelled like rain and wood smoke. The pavement shimmered from last night's drizzle, and the sky was the kind of gray that seemed to stretch forever. My suitcase wheels scraped against the front steps as I dragged them down. My father stood in the doorway, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other holding his coffee. "Take care of yourself," he said, as if I were going on a weekend trip, not leaving home for good. My mother stood behind him, arms crossed, her face unreadable. I waited for something more, a hug, a goodbye worth remembering. But it never came. Then I heard the front gate creak open. Grandma June came rushing out in her worn blue sweater, her silver hair tucked under a scarf. She wrapped her arms around me so tight I could barely breathe. "Go," she whispered into my ear. "Don't look back. One day you'll know why this had to happen." I nodded, even though I didn't understand. The bus ride to Los Angeles felt endless. Oregon's damp green faded into California's sun-scorched gold. I pressed my forehead against the window, watching the landscape shift, trying to believe that I was really doing it, starting over. When I arrived at UCLA, the campus felt enormous, alive, and a little terrifying. The dorm room smelled like paint and cheap carpet. My roommate Kayla had already claimed the good side of the room and was blasting pop music from her laptop. She turned, flashing a bright smile. "You must be Maddie." "Oregon, right?" "Yeah," I said, setting my suitcase down. "Don't worry," she said, laughing. "You'll love everyone here's reinventing themselves." That night, while she watched reality TV, with the volume up, I sat cross-legged on my narrow bed, eating instant noodles and sketching ideas in the same old notebook I'd brought from home. The hum of her laughter, the smell of cheap perfume, the sound of the city outside. It all blurred into a strange kind of freedom. I was still invisible, but here, invisibility didn't hurt. It felt like possibility. I spent most of my free time in the woodshop at the architecture building. That's where I met Calvin Brooks. He was a visiting instructor. Gray hair hands like sandpaper eyes that missed nothing. The first time he caught me trying to cut a beam without measuring twice, he barked, "You trying to build a house or a disaster?" I froze, embarrassed. "Sorry. He waved a hand. "Don't apologize. Measure again. You can't listen to a material if you're too busy explaining yourself." Later, as he helped me align the plank, he said, "If you want to build spaces for people, you have to learn to listen. Wood talks back if you pay attention." Most people don't. I didn't really get it then, but something about the way he said it stuck. Maybe because no one had ever told me listening was a skill worth having. By my second year, I was spending more hours in the workshop than in my dorm. The smell of sawdust, the hum of the machines. It was my language. Calvin would stop by, hands in his pockets, and ask, "What are you building today, Ro?" "Something that stands." I'd say, "Good answer." He'd nod, walking away with a faint grin. One afternoon, after weeks of drafting and redrawing, I built my first full-frame structure, a small wooden pavilion. When the last beam slotted into place, sunlight streamed through the gaps, catching the floating dust in gold. I stood in the middle, my hands trembling, and for the first time in years, I smiled without forcing it. Graduation came faster than I expected. Lydia sent a congratulatory text. Short, polite, obligatory. My parents didn't come. I told people they were too busy, but the truth was I never invited them. I didn't want their pity or their lukewarm applause. I wanted that moment to belong only to me. After college, I stayed in Los Angeles. I rented a garage in Culver City that smelled like motor oil and possibility. With $300 and a borrowed table saw, I started Solform Studio. I hand-painted the sign myself and hung it above the door. The words beneath it read, "Form follows soul." The first few months were rough. I slept on a futon behind my drafting desk. My first clients were coffee shops and tiny apartment owners who couldn't afford real designers. I worked nights at a furniture store to keep the lights on. Still, every time I stepped into that garage and turned on the lamp, I felt something I'd never felt before. Belonging not to people, but to purpose. Sometimes when exhaustion hit, I'd think about my family. I'd wonder if they even knew what I was doing, if my name ever came up at the dinner table. Then I'd shake it off, pick up the pencil, and keep drawing. By 2012, I had my first real contract, an eco-friendly cafe renovation. Calvin visited the site once leaning on his cane, watching me work. "Looks solid," he said. "You found your rhythm." "Trying to," I said. He chuckled. "Don't try too hard. The work should breathe, not beg." That night, as I locked up the site, his words kept circling in my head. The work should breathe. I wondered if people could too. Over the years, the studio grew. I hired 2 assistants, bought real equipment, even had a client list that meant something. But the more I built, the more I realized that success didn't shrink the old shadows. It only stretched them. No matter how high I climbed, there was always that quiet whisper at the back of my mind. "You'll never outbuild where you came from." In 2010, my phone buzzed late one afternoon while I was sketching a new housing project. It was my mother. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her tone brisk. "Your sister's getting married next month. We thought you might want to come early, help with the decorations. You're good with your hands, right?" I felt the old ache rise. "I'm in the middle of a project," I said. "Of course you are," she sighed. "You've always got some project." Then softer. "Just try to be here." It would mean a lot to her. I wanted to ask, "What about me?" But the words stayed locked behind my teeth. When the call ended, I sat for a long time, staring at the half-finished blueprint on my desk. The pencil slipped from my fingers, rolling to the edge of the table before falling to the floor. Out the window, the sun was setting behind the hills, turning the city gold. My reflection looked back at me in the glass. Older, steadier, but still carrying something heavy. I picked up the pencil again and whispered to the empty room. "I have my own house to build." Then I turned off the light, leaving the studio bathed in twilight, and let the sound of the city fill the silence I used to call home. The air inside Solform Studio that spring smelled like fresh-cut plywood and coffee gone cold. My office had always been cluttered. Rolled-up blueprints stacked against the wall models, half built on the workbench, the hum of the city outside leaking through the windows. I remember standing over the conference table, pointing at the projection on the screen. The Ecohaven Project. I said, my voice steady, but my palms slick with sweat. A sustainable housing community that breathes with its surroundings. Everything, from insulation to furniture, is built from reclaimed materials. No waste, no excess. It's not just a design, it's a statement. Across from me sat Harold Green, the senior investor. His suit looked like it had been ironed by a machine, his expression carved in permanent skepticism. "Recycled wood," he said slowly, as if the words were foreign. "That's interesting, but expensive. You're sure clients will buy into that kind of purity?" I met his gaze. "They don't have to buy purity," I said. "They just have to feel peace when they walk inside." He leaned back, arms crossed. "You've got passion, Ms. Rowe. I'll give you that." I didn't realize then that passion to people like Harold was the same as inexperience. 2 months later, I found out what that really meant. I was at my desk late one evening when my intern Chloe came rushing in, phone in hand. "Maddie, you need to see this," she said. She showed me an online article announcing a new sustainable housing project, led by a designer named Eric Dalton, one of my former associates. The renderings on the screen were mine. Every beam, every window angle, every detail down to the planters I'd designed in the corners. Even the tagline. "A home that breathes." My words. For a moment, I couldn't breathe at all. I scrolled through the article, my name nowhere to be found. The sponsor was Harold Green and Associates. There was a quote from Harold Dalton brings a fresh, innovative vision to modern, sustainable architecture. My ears rang. The room felt smaller. That night, I sat in my office until midnight, staring at my designs spread across the table. I could almost hear Calvin Brooks's voice from years ago. "Measure twice before you build." I'd measured everything but trust. The next morning, I called Harold's office. He answered on speakerphone. "Maddie." "I was just about to call you," he said in his usual smooth tone. "You stole my design," I said. "You know those plans were mine." He sighed as though I were being dramatic. "You're young. These things happen. You should take it as a compliment. Besides, Dalton has more experience managing large projects. It's better this way. Step aside while the grown-ups handle the execution." I gripped the edge of my desk, knuckles white. "You can't take credit for my work." "I'm not taking credit," he said. "I'm taking responsibility. You should learn the difference." Then he hung up. The silence that followed burned. For a week, I went through every file, every timestamp, every email, documenting everything. Then I called the only person I trusted to help. Jacob Allen, a law school classmate from UCLA who had turned into a sharp, unshakable attorney. When he answered, his voice was still warm, the same dry humor I remembered. "Madeline Rowe," he said. "Haven't heard that name since college. What's on fire?" "Everything," I said. "They stole my design." Jacob paused, then said quietly, "Do you have proof I have everything I said?" "Then don't stay quiet," he replied. "That's how they win." The following weeks blurred into depositions, documents, and long hours in conference rooms that smelled like burnt coffee and ego. Harold's lawyers tried to drown me in paperwork, but Jacob kept me afloat. He'd slide a cup of tea across the table and whisper, "Don't give them the reaction they want." When the trial began, I wore a simple black blazer, my hair pulled back tight. I stood before the judge and projected my original design files onto the courtroom screen. Each layer of the blueprint stamped with date and time, my name embedded in the metadata. Dalton sat across the aisle, avoiding my eyes. Harold's lawyer tried to argue that I'd inspired the project, but hadn't executed it. I opened my laptop, pulled up an email Harold had sent me 6 months before, attaching the exact renderings now being used. "He sent these," I said, my voice steady. "To me, before Dalton even joined the project." The room went quiet. Dalton looked like he wanted to sink into his chair. When the judge delivered the verdict 2 weeks later, the words felt both heavy and unreal. The court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Madeline Rowe. Damages awarded $5.8 million. $5.8 million. It was more money than I'd ever imagined touching. But as the gavel came down, all I felt was exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, the sky had turned gray, misting with the faintest drizzle. Reporters waited on the steps. Microphones ready, but I walked past them. Jacob caught up, holding an umbrella over my head. "You did it," he said. I nodded. "It doesn't feel like winning." He studied me for a second. "What are you going to do now?" I looked out at the rain, at the city shimmering beneath it. "I'm going to build something no one can take away." He smiled. "Now that sounds like you." A few days later, the settlement check arrived. I deposited it, then deleted every article about the case from my phone. But one headline caught my eye before it disappeared. It was from an architecture blog. The title read, "Green responds to verdict justice doesn't restore reputation." I clicked it. Harold's quote glared back at me. "The court can't rewrite history. Some people damage the credibility of our industry by pretending to be victims." I leaned back in my chair, letting the words roll off me like rain. There was a time when that would have broken me, when I would have tried to explain myself to defend what was already proven true. Not anymore. I turned my gaze to the sketches pinned along my wall, plans for a home I'd been quietly drafting for months. Glass, cedar, and light. Something strong but breathing. Something mine. "Reputation," I murmured. "You can keep yours, Harold." I picked up my pencil, feeling its weight. Mine will be built from wood glass and daylight. The pencil met paper. The first lines of Saul Cliff Villa began to take shape. Outside, the rain fell harder, tapping against the window like a heartbeat. And somewhere in that rhythm, I found the quiet, determined sound of starting over. The first time I stood on the cliff in Santa Cruz, the wind nearly knocked me over. The Pacific stretched out below, gray, endless, restless. The land itself seemed to tremble with the waves hitting the rocks beneath it. I could taste salt in the air. Cal Brooks squinted toward the water hands buried in his tool belt. "This place," he said, shouting over the gusts, "needs someone with guts." I pulled my jacket tighter and looked at the line where sea met sky. "I'm too tired to be scared," I said. Cal chuckled that deep, gravelly laugh of his. "That's close enough." Behind us, Miguel Reyes was unloading the surveying equipment from his truck, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. "We'll need reinforced beams here," he said, pointing toward the slope. "The wind will eat ordinary structures alive." "I know," I said. "That's why I chose it." They both turned to look at me. Cal smiled like he understood more than he said. The first few weeks were nothing but mud, wind, and noise. Steel met wood hammers, met nails, and the cliff shook with every strike. I stayed later than everyone else most nights, pacing across the uneven ground with a flashlight in one hand and a roll of blueprints in the other. Every board that went up felt like an act of rebellion against the people who doubted me, against the silence I'd been raised to accept. At night, when the crew left, I'd sit in my truck with the heater on, staring out at the half-built skeleton of what would become Saul Cliff Villa. I'd whisper to it, "You're not just a house. You're proof." In February, when the first frame was finished, Lydia called. Her number flashed across the screen while I was checking the anchor bolts with Miguel. I hesitated before answering. "Hey, sis," she said brightly. "Guess what? We're having a baby." I froze. "That's great, Lydia. Really great. You should have heard Mom," she went on. She cried. "Dad's already talking about setting up a college fund." I swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "That's wonderful. Tell them congratulations from me. You could call them yourself, you know," she said gently. "They'd love to hear from you." I looked at the half-finished structure in front of me, the open ribs of wood catching the sea wind. "Maybe one day," I said. "I'm a little busy right now." After we hung up, I put my phone back in my pocket and went back to work. Cal noticed the look on my face but didn't say anything. He just handed me a wrench and said, "Tighten it yourself. Feels different when it's your own hands doing it." We worked through spring and summer. The house began to take shape, glass panels facing the ocean cedar siding, glowing in the afternoon light. Cal and I argued constantly about the angle of the stairwell, the height of the balcony, the type of screws that would last longer in the salt air. But beneath every argument was a shared respect. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, Miguel leaned against a beam, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You know," he said, "most people who build houses this close to the ocean worry about erosion not healing." I smiled faintly. "I'm not most people." By fall, the walls were up, the windows sealed the steel spiral staircase gleaming like sculpture in the center of the space. Sometimes when the light hit just right, the glass walls reflected the horizon so perfectly, it looked as if the ocean flowed straight through the house. I didn't notice how attached I'd grown to the crew until winter came and storms started rolling in from the coast. We'd spend hours securing tarps and covering equipment, laughing through the rain. It felt like family, not the one I was born into, but one I'd chosen through work and sweat and shared silence. Then came the night of the storm, February 2024. The wind howled so hard it felt like the world was splitting in half. I was alone in the half-finished living room, checking the sealant on the glass walls, when I heard the first crack. The upper frame groaned. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the scaffold, rain slicing across my face. The storm had torn a panel loose. Water poured in, soaking the floor. I shouted for help even though no one was there. Then headlights appeared through the sheets of rain. Cal's truck. He ran toward me, soaked to the bone, yelling, "You're out of your damn mind." "Help me with the tarp," I screamed back. Together, we fought the storm, pulling plastic over the opening, tying it down as wind clawed at our clothes. My hands slipped rope, burning my palms. Cal's hat flew off into the night. At one point, lightning split the sky, and for a second, everything, the rain, the house, even the cliff, was frozen in white light. We didn't stop until the wind began to die. The tarp held. We stood there, drenched, breathing hard, staring out at the black ocean. "Thought you said you weren't scared," Cal panted. "I'm not," I said, chest heaving. "I just don't want to lose it before it's real." He nodded, eyes softening. Now that he said is the kind of fear that builds things. When dawn broke, the sky was pale silver. The sea below was calm again, pretending it hadn't tried to destroy us a few hours earlier. I sat on the steps, soaked and shaking, watching the first light spill over the horizon. I wasn't afraid of collapse anymore. I'd seen it up close. I'd fought it with my own hands. I whispered to myself, "I'm not afraid of breaking. I'm afraid of having nothing left to rebuild." That morning when the crew returned, the house still stood. A little scarred, but standing. Like me. By October 2024, Saul Cliff Villa was finished. The cedar siding had turned honey gold in the sun. The glass walls shimmered with reflections of the Pacific. Inside, the spiral staircase wound upward like a ribbon of light. The air smelled of salt and sawdust. I ran my hand along the smooth surface of the long dining table I'd built from reclaimed oak. The grain glowed under the morning light, the long table. I murmured. The name came to me like a whisper, something meant for others as much as for me. A week later, Grandma June arrived. She stepped through the glass doors, her gray hair catching the sea breeze, eyes wide with awe. "Lord Maddie," she said softly, "you built this?" I nodded. Every inch. She walked to the window, staring out at the ocean that seemed to stretch forever. "You did more than build a house," she said, turning to me. "You built a declaration." Her words hit me deeper than any award or headline ever could. When she hugged me, I caught the faint scent of her lavender perfume, the same one from my childhood. For the first time in years, I felt like a child who'd finally come home, not to a place, but to something she'd made with her own hands. That night, as the sun sank into the ocean, and the villa filled with amber light, I sat at the long table, tracing its edges with my fingers. Outside, the waves whispered against the cliffs, steady, unending. The wind rattled the glass, but the walls held. The house held. And so did I. The smell of paint and glue filled the small craft room at Harbor Light's home. The windows fogged from the warmth inside, a stark contrast to the chill of November pressing against the glass. I handed a box of recycled wood scraps to a group of kids sitting around the table, their laughter spilling into the air like music. Sister Kathleen, the woman who ran the orphanage, smiled at me from across the room. Her silver cross gleamed softly under the fluorescent lights. "Thank you again for this, Ms. Rowe," she said. "They've been looking forward to your visit all week." "Please," I said, smiling. "It's Maddie, and they're the ones doing all the work." A small, blonde girl with blue paint on her cheeks raised her hand. "Ms. Maddie, do you build real houses?" "Sometimes," I said, crouching beside her. "But I think you're doing something harder. You're making beauty out of leftovers." She grinned and held up her project, a tiny birdhouse, crooked but charming. Her fingers were stained green and red from paint. "I'm Emma," she said proudly. "I want to build things like you when I grow up." "Well, Emma, I said you've already started." She looked at me with sudden seriousness. "Do you have anyone to spend Christmas with?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, brushing a lock of hair from her face. Maybe with you, I said softly. If you'll have me. Emma giggled, then nodded as if sealing a secret pact. Later, while helping Sister Kathleen organize supplies, I watched the children chase each other through the hallway. Their laughter echoed off the peeling walls. Sister Kathleen sighed, folding her hands. Most of them have never had a proper Christmas, she said. We do what we can, but you know how funding is. I looked out the window toward the playground, where the rusty swing set glistened under the weak sunlight. What would it look like? I asked quietly if this year they did. She turned to me, puzzled. I met her eyes. A real Christmas. Food, warmth, gifts. A table big enough for everyone. Her expression softened. That's a beautiful thought. As I drove home along the coastal highway, the idea wouldn't let go. The cliffs glowed amber in the setting sun, and the sea seemed to pulse with life below. The long table waited in my villa, empty and shining. I could almost see it in my mind, candles, flickering plates, full laughter filling the air, a table where no one was missing. When I got home, I didn't even take off my coat. I sat down at my drafting table and began scribbling notes on a scrap of blueprint paper, guest list, menu, transportation, gifts. I called Aunt Marianne first. Aunt M. Maddie, sweetheart. It's been ages. How's that palace of yours by the ocean? I'm finally ready to use it, I said, my voice steady. I want to host a Christmas dinner for the kids at Harbor Lights. There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. Now that sounds like something worth baking for. I'll bring my lemon tarts. Make extra, I said. I'm expecting 20 guests. After hanging up, I contacted a local bus company, then a toy store in Santa Cruz, ordering enough dolls, puzzles, and books to fill a small warehouse. I called a florist to prepare evergreen garlands and wreaths and a bakery to make gingerbread cookies shaped like stars. The house would smell like cinnamon and cedar, like something alive. Days blurred into nights of planning. I spent hours stringing lights along the beams, draping them from the rafters of the great room. The villa transformed under my hands. Warm, glowing alive. Then, in the middle of all that motion, an email popped up on my laptop. It was from a reporter at the Santa Cruz Chronicle. Ms. Rowe, we'd love to interview you for a piece about your architectural work, particularly Saul Cliff Villa. A self-built coastal mansion is rare. Please respond by Friday. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then clicked delete. The next morning, the article appeared anyway. Architect builds 6 Meller. Ocean Villa alone. A woman's testament to perseverance. There was no photo of me, just a drone shot of the house at sunset. The headlines spread quickly, shared across local news sites. My phone buzzed nonstop. Clients, colleagues, people from college, even strangers congratulating me. I turned it face down on the counter and went back to hanging ornaments on the tree. That's when the text came. We won't be coming to your Christmas dinner. It's a waste of time. It was from my mother. I read it once, twice. My hands trembled slightly, the string of lights twisting between my fingers. For a moment, I just stood there, surrounded by boxes of decorations and half-lit bulbs. I'd thought maybe, just maybe, the invitation would be enough to bring them here. To make them see what I'd built, not just the house, but the life inside it. But there it was again. The same cold certainty I'd known since childhood. I placed the phone on the table, the screen glowing against the wood. The reflection of the lights flickered across its surface like tiny fires. They've been saying that my whole life, I whispered. That everything I do is a waste. I climbed the ladder, finishing the last string of lights along the ceiling. The bulbs blinked on one by one, washing the glass walls in warm gold. The house seemed to exhale around me, alive again. But this time, I said softly, "They don't know the gift they've given me." The words came out as a breath, half laugh, half sigh. When I finished decorating, I sat at the long oak table and opened my notebook. The guest list filled one page. Sister Kathleen, Emma Gray, Harbor Lights. Home, 19. Children. I picked up a pen, hesitated for a moment, then added a final line at the bottom. 20 children, all invited. The ink bled slightly into the paper, but I didn't mind. Outside, the wind howled against the cliffs, and the sea answered with a low roar. Inside, the lights shimmered over the polished wood, reflecting in the windows like stars. I leaned back in my chair, watching the room glow. The table was ready. The house was ready. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to show up. This Christmas, I would fill every empty chair myself. The call came just after sunrise. I was in the kitchen stirring sugar into my coffee when my phone buzzed across the counter. The name on the screen made me pause. Nora Bennett. ABC News. I didn't know her personally, but I knew her voice. She was one of those reporters who made people listen, not because she shouted, but because she didn't have to. "Ms. Rowe," she said when I answered. Her tone was calm, clipped professional. "I heard about your Christmas dinner project." I hesitated. "Project." "The one for the children from Harbor Lights," she continued. "A $6 million ocean villa turned into a feast for orphans. That's not just a story. It's what America needs right now." Her words hung in the air like frost. I walked to the window looking out at the cliffs. The sky was pale, the sea restless. "It's not a story," I said. "It's just dinner." Nora laughed softly. "Everything's a story, Maddie. The question is, who gets to tell it?" 2 days later, we met at a small cafe off the Pacific Coast Highway. The place was nearly empty, the kind of spot where the smell of roasted beans lingered longer than the customers. Steam rose from our cups as rain tapped against the window. Nora wore a gray sweater and no makeup, her eyes sharp but not unkind. She studied me over the rim of her coffee. So she began. "Why this?" "Why now?" I stirred my drink. "Because the house finally feels like it's missing something." She raised a brow. "People say you're doing this to fix your image after that lawsuit." I met her gaze. "People like Harold Green." A faint smirk curved her lips. "He did have some colorful things to say online. He called your event, what was it? Performative compassion." I didn't flinch. If people need to believe that to make themselves comfortable, I can't stop them. But I'm not cooking a meal to be forgiven. I'm cooking because I don't want to feel cold anymore. Nora's pen stopped moving. She looked up, studying me for a long moment. Outside, a gull screamed against the wind. "That's not the answer I expected," she said finally. "Good," I replied. "Maybe it's the one that matters." She sat back, her expression softening. "All right, we'll cover it. But your name stays off until the broadcast airs." I nodded. "If you're going to film it, don't make it about me. Focus on their sources, the kids, the volunteers. That's the story." Her eyes flickered with something. Respect, maybe. Deal. When I got home that afternoon, the storm had followed me. The wind whistled through the eaves, shaking the glass walls. My laptop pinged again. I didn't want to open it, but curiosity won. Harold Green had posted a public statement on LinkedIn. "Beware of architects who mistake charity for publicity. Some people rebuild their reputations with pity instead of integrity." The post already had hundreds of reactions, most of them supportive. I scrolled through the comments, each one cutting in its own small way. "She's milking the lawsuit. $6 million could have gone to real causes." Another rich woman trying to look humble. My throat tightened, but I didn't reply. I closed the laptop and sat there in the quiet hum of the storm. The world outside could think what it wanted. They didn't know what this dinner meant, or who it was for. Cal dropped by later, carrying a box of lights. He took one look at my face and frowned. "You saw it, didn't you?" "Yeah," I said. "The whole city's apparently got opinions." He set the box down and leaned against the counter. "You planning to respond?" "No," I forced a smile. "I'll let the food do the talking." He grinned. "You always did fight better with a hammer than with words." "Or a whisk," I said, and for the first time that day I laughed. Over the next week, Nora's team prepared the shoot. Her cameraman, a 20-something named Leo, came by to scout the property. He was quiet with that eager energy of someone still finding his place in the world. He walked through the great room, eyes wide. "Wow," he whispered. "It's like the ocean's inside the house." "That's the idea," I said. "The view does most of the work." Nora was more reserved, taking notes, testing lighting angles. At one point, she stopped near the long table and ran her fingers along the polished oak. "It's beautiful," she said. "You designed this yourself." "I built it myself," I corrected gently. She nodded, glancing around. "You know it's strange. Most stories we tell about people like you are about what they've gained. This feels more like what you're trying to give away." I didn't answer. That night after the crew left, I sat by the fireplace scrolling through the news again. The same headline kept popping up on smaller blogs: architects, luxury charity sparks controversy. Photos of the villa flooded social media. I could feel the narrative forming around me. One I hadn't written. For a moment, I wanted to call Nora and cancel everything. But then I remembered Emma's paint-stained hands, her tiny voice asking if I had anyone to spend Christmas with. No, this wasn't about me. The next morning, the sky was the color of pewter. The waves below crashed in long, rhythmic bursts. I could hear Cal's truck in the driveway, followed by the low hum of engines pulling in behind him. I stepped outside just as Nora and her crew arrived. She rolled down the car window, the wind whipping her hair into her face. "Hope you don't mind the weather," I said. "Santa Cruz likes to test people before it lets them stay." She smiled faintly. "Rain makes good lighting." Leo unloaded the cameras, his jacket soaked already. Nora climbed out, tightening her scarf. "Maddie," she said over the wind, "I need to say this before we start. I know how this looks. Some people think we're here to glorify you or expose you. But if I'm wrong about you, if this isn't what I think it is, I'll say it myself on camera." I studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You won't have to. Just film the truth." She gave a small smile. "Fair enough." The first drops of rain began to fall, soft but steady, dotting the steps that led to the villa's glass doors. I could smell the salt and wet earth, hear the faint hum of the sea below. Nora pulled her notebook from her coat and gestured toward the entrance. "Let's begin," she said. I opened the door wide, the light spilling out behind me, like warmth breaking through cold. "Come in," I told her. "Let's show them what a real Christmas looks like." The wind picked up, scattering raindrops across the terrace. As the crew stepped inside, Nora turned once more toward me. "You ready for this?" she asked. I met her gaze. "I've been ready my whole life." And as the storm gathered outside, the cameras began to roll. By late afternoon, the light over Santa Cruz had turned gold, the kind of light that makes the ocean look like it's been brushed with fire. The wind howled around Saul Cliff Villa, carrying the sound of waves crashing far below. Inside, the house glowed. Hundreds of small golden bulbs traced the beams wrapped around the banisters and shimmered across the glass walls like captured stars. Cal was tightening the last screw on a chair leg while I checked the length of the tablecloth. The long table stretched nearly the entire room, candles flickering down its center. "Looks like something out of a magazine," Cal said, standing back. "Let's hope it feels better than it looks," I replied. He smiled. "It will." Outside, I could see the first headlights winding up the coastal road. My heart kicked. The children were here. When the bus doors opened, laughter spilled out into the cold air. Emma was the first to step down, her coat zipped all the way up, her hat slightly crooked. Behind her came a trail of small faces, each one wide-eyed, blinking at the sight of the villa glowing against the dark sky. "Whoa," a boy whispered. "It's like a castle." Emma took a step forward, staring through the glass doors at the tree in the great room, 12 feet tall, covered in ribbons, ornaments, and soft white lights. "It looks like a storybook," she breathed. I knelt beside her, fixing the end of her scarf. "Not a storybook, Emma," I said. "Tonight, you're the main character." She giggled and ran inside, the air filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine, of bread baking and candles burning low. Aunt Marianne was in the kitchen, her cheeks pink from the oven's heat, sliding trays of gingerbread cookies onto the counter. "Don't you dare touch these yet," she warned Cal, who was hovering too close. He held up his hands, laughing. "I'm just quality control." "Quality control my foot," she muttered, shooing him away. From the doorway, I watched it all unfold. The swirl of coats and scarves being hung up, the sound of small shoes clattering on the floor, the music Nora had put on low in the background. Bing Crosby's voice drifted softly through the air. Nora and her cameraman Leo moved quietly around the room. They weren't intrusive, just capturing pieces of the evening, Emma spinning in front of the tree, 2 boys helping set out napkins. Marianne's hands dusted with flour. At one point, Nora asked, "Do you mind if we film you setting the name cards?" I nodded. "As long as you get the details right." She watched as I placed the cards one by one along the table. Each one carried the same phrase written in soft silver ink: "You belong here." Leo zoomed in, the camera catching my fingers, smoothing the edges of the paper. For a brief moment, I felt the weight of what those words meant. For years, I'd waited for someone else to say them. Tonight, I was the one giving them away. When dinner began, the noise was immediate and joyful. Forks clinking, children laughing. Cal pouring steaming mugs of cider, Marianne sneaking extra cookies to the kids at the end of the table. The warmth spread through the house like light. I looked around and tried to memorize every detail. Emma's freckled grin as she held her plate with both hands. Sister Kathleen's soft smile as she helped one of the little ones cut their food. The reflection of the candles dancing in the glass walls. For a moment, I forgot about the cameras, the outside world, the headlines. It was just us. 30 people bound together by warmth, by food, by the simple grace of being seen. I'd spent so many nights in my life staring at an empty seat waiting for someone to fill it, waiting for a voice to call my name to tell me I mattered. But that night I realized I didn't need to wait anymore. I didn't need an invitation. I was the one sending them. When the first notes of Silent Night began to play, the room quieted. The children's voices rose soft but sure, weaving through the sound of the ocean outside. Nora stopped filming halfway through the song. She just stood there, her camera hanging loosely at her side, eyes glistening as she watched. The candles flickered. The waves crashed. The sound of their singing filled every corner of the villa. When the song ended, there was a hush so complete it felt sacred. Then Emma stood up, holding her small paper crown slightly askew. "Can I say something?" she asked. "Of course," I said. She turned to face everyone, her voice trembling at first. "I just wanted to say, thank you, Ms. Maddie. I didn't know Christmas could feel warm like this." The room went still. My throat tightened. "Now you do," I said softly. "And don't forget it." Applause erupted around the table. Clapping laughter, someone tapping their spoon against a glass. Emma sat down, cheeks flushed, and Sister Kathleen patted her hand proudly. Later, when the plates were cleared and the music turned gentle again, I slipped away to the terrace. The air was cool, the wind calmer now. Below, the sea shimmered under the moonlight, endless and alive. Through the glass, I could still see everyone inside. Cal helping Marianne box leftovers. Leo packing up the camera, Nora sitting with Emma, talking quietly. I pressed my hand against the cold glass. The reflections of the lights shimmered across it, blending with the faint image of my own face. This, I thought, was what wholeness looked like. Not perfection, not applause, just the quiet fullness that comes when nothing is missing. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel too big. It felt exactly right. I sat on the edge of the terrace bench, listening to the steady rhythm of the waves. The night had settled soft and still. Inside, laughter continued faint and fading. Outside, the ocean breathed in and out. And for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, the ghosts of every empty Christmas I'd ever known had finally found a place to rest. Christmas night settled over the coast like a heavy quilt of fog and salt. The last of the children had fallen asleep in the guest rooms upstairs, their laughter fading into soft breaths and the hum of the ocean below. Cal stacked dishes in the kitchen while Aunt Marianne packed away the leftovers, humming quietly. The villa felt peaceful, spent but alive. I sat cross-legged on the rug in front of the fireplace when Nora's voice came faintly from the television. "It's starting," Cal called from the kitchen. The ABC News logo flashed across the screen, followed by the title, Christmas of Hope. The footage opened with a sweeping drone shot of Saul Cliff Villa glowing against the dark sea. The lights reflected off the waves like floating gold. Nora's narration drifted over it, calm, even, and warm. High above the cliffs of Santa Cruz sits a house built by a woman who once believed she didn't belong at anyone's table, she said. This year she decided to build one long enough for everyone. Cal stopped drying his hands. Marianne came to stand beside the couch. Even the few kids who were still awake, Emma among them, gathered near the fireplace, their eyes wide. The camera cut to scenes from the dinner. Emma's laugh as she bit into a cookie, Marianne pulling bread from the oven. Cal helping a boy pour cider. Then there was me, hands placing cards along the table, the silver letters catching the light. "You belong here." I felt my stomach twist as I watched myself move through the scene like a stranger. Nora's voice continued. Architect Madeline Rowe turned her $6 million coastal villa into a haven for children who had never experienced Christmas at home. No sponsors, no press releases, just light warmth and the sound of laughter echoing through the glass. I turned my gaze toward the fire, the flicker of orange on my palms. I hadn't expected her to say my name. Nora had promised to wait until the broadcast, but hearing it spoken aloud on national television still made my chest tighten. The report cut to an interview clip. I recognized it instantly, the one she'd taken quietly before the dinner started. She had asked me, "Why do this?" And my recorded voice answered, "Because I know what it feels like to wait for a seat that never opens." So I decided to build one myself. The room around me stayed silent. Even Cal didn't move. The last scene showed Emma standing beside the tree, her paper crown slightly tilted, saying, "I didn't know Christmas could feel this warm." Then the music swelled, and Nora's final words filled the room. "This isn't a story about wealth or charity. It's a story about how one woman turned solitude into belonging. Her name is Madeline Rowe, architect, builder, and the designer of a home made of light." The screen faded to black. No one spoke for a while. Then Marianne sniffed, wiping at her cheek. "She made it sound like poetry," she said softly. Cal smiled faintly. "It was—" Emma crawled up beside me and leaned her head on my shoulder. "You were on TV," she whispered. "Guess so." I said, brushing a strand of her hair away, "But you're the star, remember?" Outside, the sea kept its steady rhythm. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the waves and the faint crackle of the fire. Hundreds of miles away, another living room was watching the same story. I didn't need to see it to imagine it. Portland, my parents' house. The same old couch, the faint smell of pine from the artificial tree they'd used for years. I could see my mother Eleanor frozen on the edge of the sofa, one hand pressed to her mouth. My father leaning forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the screen as Nora said my name. Lydia sitting beside them, silent. Maybe they hadn't even known the broadcast was coming. Maybe the neighbors had called to tell them. In my mind, I could hear my mother's voice. Soft, almost breaking. "Oh my God." And my father's rough, uncertain. "She did all that. Without telling us." Then Lydia's cracking under something that had been building for years. "Because we never listened." I didn't know if that was really what happened, but I could feel it. The weight of realization spreading across that room like a sudden cold draft. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The notifications flashed faster than I could read them. Emails, messages, missed calls, my old college classmates, reporters, former clients, strangers, and then, the ones that mattered most, from Dad. "You embarrassed us. Everyone's asking why we weren't there." From Mom. "We look like fools. You should have told us before the cameras did." Another message came seconds later. "People are calling nonstop. What were you thinking?" I sat by the window watching the tide roll in under a pale gray sky. My tea had gone cold. The words blurred together until they didn't look like language anymore. Just noise. They weren't calling out of pride. They were calling out of fear. Fear of being left out, of not controlling the story for once. They'd spent years editing my life down to something that fit their comfort. And now, for the first time, I'd written a version they couldn't revise. The phone vibrated again. Mom calling. The name glowed on the screen, sharp against the soft morning light. I stared at it, my thumb hovering above the answer button. Outside, the waves hit the rocks with rhythmic precision. The sound filled the silence between each vibration of the phone. I thought about picking up, about the same old conversation that would follow. "Why didn't you tell us? Why make us look bad? Why can't you just—" I let the phone ring until it stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, but not cruel. Just still. I set the phone on the table and looked out at the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly silver and calm. My reflection ghosted faintly on the glass, overlapping with the moving water beyond. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the ache of old longing stir again. Smaller now, quieter. It didn't hurt like it used to. It just reminded me that I'd finally stepped out of their story and into my own. The phone lit up once more, then went dark. I wrapped my hands around the cooling cup of tea, closed my eyes, and breathed. The sea kept breathing with me, patient, endless. And though my heart ached, there was peace in it, a stillness that no call could break. By the third morning after Christmas, the world outside my window no longer felt quiet. The sea still moved the same way, but everything else had changed. My inbox overflowed. My name was trending. Clips of the dinner had gone viral. Emma laughing under the lights, me hugging her goodnight, the camera panning to the table, glowing like gold. Someone had added piano music and posted it on Twitter. The caption read, "When kindness builds more than walls, The hashtag Christmas of Hope was everywhere. I didn't recognize the world watching me now. Every few seconds my phone buzzed, reporters requesting interviews, strangers thanking me for reminding them of the real meaning of Christmas. It was surreal how a quiet act of giving had become a broadcast spectacle. At first I tried to ignore it, but the messages kept coming. One from an old professor, one from a construction crew in Texas, who said my story made them rebuild their local shelter. Even one from an architecture magazine asking to feature Saul Cliff Villa. I wanted to be proud. Instead, I felt oddly detached, like I was floating above it all. Miles away in Portland, the story landed differently. Neighbors stopped Eleanor and Robert Rowe in grocery stores, at church, even outside their house. "We saw your daughter on ABC," someone said to my mother as she carried her shopping bag to the car. "Beautiful piece. Why weren't you there? Didn't she invite you?" Mom had no answer. She just smiled tightly, eyes darting away. At dinner that night, she told my father. "People think we abandoned her." He frowned, setting down his fork. "Maybe it's time we make things clear. This portrayal of us. It's not right," Lydia, sitting at the end of the table, said quietly. "Maybe it's just the truth." But Dad didn't hear her, or maybe he didn't want to. The next morning, my lawyer and old friend Jacob Allen called while I was watering the plants by the window. "You won't believe this," he said. "Try me." "Your parents filed a small claim," he said. "Technically, it's about the use of an image from your childhood home." The broadcast showed it for, 2 seconds? "They're claiming invasion of privacy." I laughed, though it came out hollow. "They want to sue me. It's a publicity stunt." "Maddie," he said. "They're embarrassed. They want to save face. Let them," I said. "If they need a courtroom to find their reflection, they can have it." Jacob sighed. "You want me to handle it?" "Yes." I said, my voice steady. "Let the law speak. I don't need to." He hesitated, then said softly, "You've changed. Maybe I just stopped explaining myself." The lawsuit didn't last long. The judge dismissed it almost immediately. "Trivial and unfounded," she said, barely glancing at the paperwork. The news spread fast. Within hours, the headlines read, "Family of Architect in Viral. Christmas Story, Drops Lawsuit." People online didn't hold back. Comment sections filled with outrage. How could her parents do that? They missed the point entirely. No wonder she built her own family. I didn't read much of it, but I saw enough to know that the tide had turned. For the first time, the court of public opinion wasn't something I feared. It was something I didn't need. Nora called that evening. "You doing all right?" she asked. "I'm fine," I said. "It's strange. The noise doesn't sound so loud anymore." "Well," she said with a smile in her voice, "sometimes the storm just teaches people who you already were." A few days later, her follow-up segment aired. She'd interviewed Grandma Sama June at her porch in Oregon. The footage was simple. Just the two of them sitting in the winter sun, steam rising from Grandma's teacup. Nora asked, "What do you think of your granddaughter's story?" Grandma smiled. "I think sometimes children have to build a new table, just so their parents can finally see which seat has been empty all along." The quote caught fire. Within hours, it was everywhere. Screenshots, memes, talk shows. People were calling it the table quote. It trended for 2 days straight. Then came the last thing I ever expected Harold Green went on air. The same man who had dismissed me, who once said I didn't belong in the grown-ups' room. He sat stiffly in a studio chair, eyes fixed on the camera. "I misjudged her," he said. "I thought she was rebuilding her name. Turns out she was rebuilding hope. And I learned that integrity doesn't need to announce itself. It just stands there and outlasts you. When I saw it, I didn't feel vindicated, just tired." That night, as the sun slipped below the ocean, the villa glowed in its usual quiet way. The media storm swirled beyond the glass walls, but inside it was just me and the sound of the waves. I opened my laptop to check emails. Among the flood of requests and articles, one subject line froze me. From Eleanor Rowe. I hesitated, then clicked. "Maddie," it began. "I don't know how to say this." I watched the segment again. "Maybe we were wrong to handle things the way we did. Your father thought the lawsuit would fix something, but it only made everything worse. We didn't mean to hurt you. Maybe you can understand we were confused, embarrassed. I don't know. I just hope one day we can talk without anger." Mom, no apology, not really. Just a fragile, reaching out, wrapped in excuses. I read it twice, then a third time. For a moment, I almost started typing back. My fingers hovered over the keys. Then I closed the laptop. I stood and walked out to the terrace. The wind hit my face cool and sharp, lifting strands of my hair. The sea below roared endless, untamed. I gripped the railing and let the air fill my lungs until the ache in my chest loosened. Justice didn't happen in courtrooms. It wasn't about verdicts or headlines. It arrived in moments like this, when the truth no longer needed my defense. Somewhere behind me the phone buzzed again, but I didn't turn around. The wind grew stronger, carrying the salt and the faint echo of waves striking rock. The villa stood firm, lights flickering softly against the night. And as I stood there, hair whipping across my face, I realized that silence, finally, felt like victory. The storm had rolled in before sunrise, heavy and gray, the kind that makes the ocean look like molten steel. By noon, the waves slammed against the cliffs so hard the windows rattled. I was finishing a sketch at my desk when the chime from my laptop broke through the sound of the rain. One new message. The name made my heart tighten. From Lydia Rowe. I hesitated before opening it. I know I don't deserve to ask, but I'd like to see you. Just me. No one else. If you'll have me, no explanations, no apologies. Just a request. By the time the rain thinned into mist, I'd already written back. Come whenever you're ready. She arrived late that afternoon. I heard the tires crunch over the gravel before I saw her through the glass. Standing by the SUV, arms wrapped around herself, her long beige coat soaked at the hem. The sea wind caught her hair as she looked up at the villa. Her expression a fragile mix of awe and regret. I opened the door before she could knock. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Maddie, she said finally, her voice trembling a little. Come in, I said, stepping aside. You'll catch a cold out there. She wiped her shoes on the mat, her eyes darting over every detail of the house. The curved staircase, the scent of cedar, the soft hum of the fire in the next room. It's even more beautiful than it looked on TV, she whispered. It wasn't built for TV, I said gently. In the living room, the fireplace crackled, filling the silence with a low, steady rhythm. Lydia sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I poured tea, the steam curling between us. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I set her cup down and sat across from her. For what? For being silent, she said, eyes glistening. For letting them talk about you like you weren't part of the family. For letting them think it was okay. Her words trembled like thin glass. I didn't interrupt. You don't have to apologize for them, I said softly. Just be honest with yourself. That's enough. She nodded, biting her lip. Mom's not doing well, she said. She hasn't left the house since the lawsuit was dismissed. She keeps saying she didn't mean it to go that far. I stared at the fire. The wood popped, sending sparks into the air. Meaning doesn't erase the damage. Lydia reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Slightly crumpled my name written on the front in my mother's careful handwriting. She wrote this, she said. She said she couldn't find the words to call. I hesitated before taking it. The paper felt warm from Lydia's hands. I opened it slowly. Maddie. I watched the broadcast again. I've replayed it more times than I'll admit. You looked whole, like someone I used to know but never really saw. I was wrong to call your dreams a waste of time. Maybe you were never the waste. Maybe you were the time I wasted. Mom. I stared at the words until they blurred. I wanted to feel anger. I wanted to feel vindicated. But what I felt most was tired. I folded the letter neatly and set it on the table. She found the words I said quietly. Lydia leaned forward. She's scared, Maddie. Of losing you for good. She already did, I said, my voice even, but maybe not forever. We sat in silence for a long time. The storm outside had softened into a steady drizzle, the waves calmer now. I heard the faint creak of the front door open, followed by familiar footsteps. Grandma June appeared, a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. I thought I heard voices, she said, smiling faintly. And look who the wind blew in. Lydia stood quickly, crossing the room to hug her. Grandma. June looked at me over Lydia's shoulder, her eyes kind but knowing. She walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. Sometimes, she said, forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's just about stopping the cycle of hurt. Her hand lingered light but steady. Lydia's tears came then. Sudden raw. I miss you, she said through a trembling breath. All those years I thought you wanted to stay away. I didn't realize you were just surviving. I looked at her for a long moment. She had our mother's eyes, but softer now. I didn't stay away because I stopped caring, I said. I stayed away because I didn't know how to come back without losing myself again. She moved toward me, hesitated, then wrapped her arms around me. For a moment, I froze, old habits tightening in my chest. Then I let go of the air I'd been holding and put my arms around her. The hug was awkward at first, then real. The kind that carried years of unsaid things. Behind us, the fire crackled louder, as if it too exhaled. Outside, the wind rose again, brushing against the windows. But inside, the warmth held. When Lydia finally pulled away, she laughed through tears. Mom would faint if she saw this. Let her, I said. Maybe it'd wake her up. June chuckled softly and moved toward the kitchen. How about tea for everyone? And something sweet to go with it. I baked this morning. A few minutes later, the three of us sat around the small table near the window, the one I'd built from reclaimed oak before the villa was finished. The rain had slowed to a mist, the horizon soft with light. The Christmas tree still stood in the corner, faintly glowing. A few ornaments tilted from where the children had touched them. Lydia reached across the table and touched my hand. I don't know if we can fix everything, she said. We don't have to, I replied. We just have to stop pretending it's not broken. June poured the tea, the steam rising like a quiet blessing. We drank in silence for a while, the fire humming softly behind us, the scent of cedar and sugar drifting through the air. Outside, the ocean breathed steady and slow, its rhythm matching ours. For the first time in years, the sound didn't feel like distance. It felt like peace. The wind carried the smell of cedar and salt that morning. The same scent that always meant December had arrived on the coast. A full year had passed since that first dinner. But Sol Cliff Villa still shimmered in the same golden light. Outside, the ocean moved like breathing glass beneath the winter sun. Inside, the long oak table stood waiting, polished and glowing, draped with white flowers and candles that flickered against the glass walls. It was Christmas Eve 2026, the second annual Christmas of Hope dinner. What had begun as one night of healing had quietly turned into a tradition. The guest list was larger this year, 25 children from Harbor Lights. 10 elderly neighbors with no family nearby, a few volunteers and locals who had come after seeing last year's broadcast. Every seat had a card that read, "You belong here." I walked slowly down the length of the table, checking each place setting, adjusting the silverware, smoothing the linens. The sea wind pushed faintly through the open terrace doors. Cal was on a ladder near the ceiling, stringing up the last row of golden bulbs. You know, he said, his voice echoing slightly. You're going to run out of room if this dinner keeps growing. I smiled, lighting one of the candles. Then I'll build a longer table. From the hallway came the soft sound of footsteps. Nora appeared, carrying a clipboard and a grin. Remind me why I volunteered to coordinate 50 people with no seating chart. Because you're secretly addicted to chaos, I teased. She laughed, shaking her head. ABC wants a few follow-up shots later tonight. Just background footage. No interviews unless you're comfortable. That's fine, I said. Just focus on the guests. They're the story now. Behind her, Lydia entered. Her cheeks flushed from the cold, carrying 2 boxes of pies. From Mom's recipe, she said with a small tentative smile. I thought it was time to share it with someone other than her. I took the boxes and set them gently on the counter. She'd like that, I said. I think she's finally starting to. Lydia replied softly. She watches every year, you know. She says the house feels different now. I didn't ask what she meant. Some things didn't need explanation anymore. Grandma June followed a few minutes later, her steps slow but steady, clutching a bouquet of white lilies. For the center of the table, she said, arranging them carefully. Something simple. You don't need extravagance when the love's already in the room. The afternoon passed in a warm blur of motion. Music played quietly from the speakers, soft jazz mixed with the sound of the waves. The guests arrived just before sunset, their laughter spilling through the open doors like sunlight. The children from Harbor Lights came running, Emma at the front, her blonde hair caught in the wind. Ms. Maddie, she shouted, waving. I remember this place. Crouched down, smiling as she threw her arms around me. And do you remember your seat? She nodded eagerly, next to the window. Then it's still yours, I said. And it always will be. As everyone settled in, Nora's crew began filming quietly from the far corner. Leo, the young cameraman, gave me a small nod before focusing on the children. The smell of roasted herbs and baked bread filled the air. Cal poured apple cider into glass pitchers while Aunt Marianne, who had decided she was officially part of the catering team now, supervised a group of volunteers plating desserts. When the cameras turned toward me, Nora's voice came gently from behind them. "Maddie," she said, "it's been a year since the first dinner. How does it feel now?" I looked toward the horizon, the ocean flashing silver beneath the fading light. "Last year," I said quietly, "I thought I built this house so people would finally see me, but I understand it differently now. I built it so no one else would ever have to feel invisible." Nora lowered her pen, watching me. The wind lifted my hair slightly, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of my own story pressing against me. It had already found its home. As darkness fell, the villa glowed. The table shimmered with candlelight reflections dancing on the glass walls. Guests passed plates, laughter rose and fell like the tide, and for a few hours the world outside seemed to disappear. Emma tugged at my sleeve midway through the meal. "Ms. Maddie," she whispered, "I remember the table from last year. It feels the same, but bigger." I smiled, kneeling beside her chair. "That's because it grows with everyone who sits at it," I said. "And you'll always have a place here, no matter how big it gets." She grinned, slipping her small hand into mine. "Promise, promise," I said. Across the room, Lydia was laughing with Nora. Grandma June was telling stories to the older guests, and Cal had found himself cornered by 2 kids asking how to use a power drill. I watched them, all the people who had once been strangers now moving like parts of the same rhythm. As dessert was served, I slipped away for a moment and went to the storage room. There, leaning against the wall, was an old chair I'd made years ago. The first one, the imperfect one from my childhood shed. The legs were uneven, the wood worn smooth by time. I carried it back into the great room, the conversation softening as people noticed. At the head of the table, I placed the chair and set a small card on the seat. On it, in the same silver ink as the others I had written, for those who never got invited. No one spoke. The fire flickered quietly behind us. Then slowly, people began to nod. One of the older guests dabbed at her eyes. Someone whispered, "That's beautiful." I stepped back, watching the light from the candles reflect off the glass, and into the dark beyond. The waves outside rolled steady and strong, their rhythm timeless. As the music rose, soft carols blending with the laughter of the children, I felt something deep inside me settle. The ache that had once lived there had softened into something else. Something whole. I looked around at the faces, the glow, the life I'd built from scraps and silence. If once I'd needed proof that I belonged, I didn't anymore. The proof was right here, in every chair, every voice, every heartbeat echoing through these walls. When the night drew to an end, I stood near the window, watching the sea shimmer in the distance. The candles burned low, the last of the guests gathered their coats, and the villa's warmth spilled softly into the cold air. I thought of the long road it had taken to reach this moment, the rejection, the quiet work, the storm, the rebuilding, and somehow it all made sense now. I turned to the camera one last time, my voice calm and sure. "My name is Maddie Rowe," I said, "and this is the story of how one person learned that sometimes rejection is a gift, because when no one leaves a seat for you, you build your own table." I looked back toward the ocean, the reflection of the villa shimmering against the water. The wind carried the faintest trace of laughter from inside, blending with the sound of the waves. Then, softly, almost like a secret meant for anyone still listening, I added, "And what about you? Have you ever built your own table?" The music swelled gently behind me, and as the lights inside flickered against the glass, the house glowed like a heartbeat. Outside, the sea kept moving calm and endless, carrying the warmth of the villa into the dark horizon. Proof that even from silence, something beautiful can rise and stay.